Paul, welcome. Welcome back to the Decision Making Studio podcast, formerly known as the All Things Risk podcast. But it's wonderful to see you and just want to welcome you to the show.
Ben, thanks for having me back. Great to be here.
So the last time we spoke, we talked about unintended consequences. And this time we're going to talk about timing. And you've written this fabulous book, Why Now? But it's been a couple of years, a little more than a couple of years. So some of my listeners may have forgotten who you are. Maybe I've got new listeners who haven't come across your work, that kind of thing. So it'd be great if you just paint a picture as to who you are, your background, what you do.
Sounds good. Well, the background on me is that I work with a lot of startups and also some corporates, really on how they are figuring out what they should go to market with, how they might grow their businesses. I've done this in a few ways, but primarily what I do is I run startup accelerator or incubator programs. So I've run a number of these in different parts of the world with different themes. I also teach at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, and I run the on-campus startup incubator program here as well. But a combination of those two sides, a bit of the teaching, a bit of the just working with portfolios of startups, or even on the corporate side, say in-house innovation groups, it's giving me this pretty broad view of how founders or how teams start to figure things out when they are going to market with something. And then what are the factors that help or hinder them along the way? But that's me kind of, day to day. Before that, I had a very direct experience related to all this. I had founded a startup in New York City. This is now about 12 years ago, I suppose. And one way or the other, always worked in tech, but kind of really appreciate this broad and systems approach to thinking about businesses.
Brilliant. So what inspired you to talk about or look into this why now question? What is it about timing that is so interesting? And it is super interesting and it's very under considered. But what was it that led you to this problem of why now? Timing and getting those factors right?
I think that this is a topic that probably many people who also are looking at many startups or portfolios of companies over time, but one way or the other, you'll come up against this timing question. So what I saw in my experience was different teams trying more or less similar businesses, but over the years, some of what makes a successful product or a startup is the team. Can the team execute? Do they work well together, even more fundamentally? But also part of that success or failure is, are they hitting the market at the right time? Are they maybe just a little too early with something that is technologically a little challenging to do or not? So like my experience, and I think the experience of probably many others who just see lots of companies over the years, you'll come up against this question of, okay, how much of success or failure is due to timing? And I remember, when I was starting to research the topic, one of the studies that I found was a research paper that where the authors had gone and surveyed, I believe it was around 800 venture capitalists, where they asked them questions about their previous investments, the failed and successful ones, and asked them to rate what were some of the reasons that companies were successful or not. And so interesting to me, timing came up. It was like one of the top reasons that they had behind a successful or a failed investment. Likewise, I've heard this timing question or this why now question be mentioned many times, but I never really saw anyone try to go deep into the question. In other words, if we all recognize that timing is important, well, how do we get some clues that we're on the right track to hit the market at the right time? Or how do we get a clue to say, actually, it's probably better to wait a little while? And so that's what I'm trying to do in this Why Now book, both give some examples as to, say, many case studies for companies that we could learn from, and then also just a general process to follow where a founder or a team might go through this process and then say, oh, by virtue of following this, this why now session or building timing maps, we think that we'll make better decisions, certainly across a portfolio of companies that we might be working with or portfolio of products that we might be trying to spin up. Yeah, so that's kind of my, I guess, the background on that and how I got to this point.
Yeah. It's fabulous. I was blown away by the number of stories of products that existed in one way, shape, or form well before what we recognize now, whether that's streaming or video. I hadn't realized that video calling has been around for such a long time. And so what was it that didn't make that work, and why does it work now? And same thing with streaming, like music streaming and things like this. It's unbelievable that a lot of stuff that we think is relatively recent actually isn't that new. It's just a question of timing. The developers of the previous products didn't get the timing right.
That's so true. So you brought up the video calling.
Yeah.
And I'm actually going to, if you don't mind, I'll talk a little about this.
Yeah.
It's an example. So this is an example of a product called the picture phone that AT&T was behind. And one of the reasons I actually like this example is I had worked at AT&T early in my career, and I never heard about this product, a $4 billion failure. I mean, decades before I joined the company, but I had never heard about it. $4 billion, if adjusted for inflation, $4 billion. And so, and likewise, like you said, like I was amazed. I had no idea that this was actually technically possible to do in the 1960s. 1970, they finally went to market with it. But so for the listeners, because you're probably not familiar with the picture phone, so this was a device, desktop device, that would enable you to have a two-way audio and video call. Well, imagine, I mean, by now, probably if you're listening to this, you have a lot of familiarity with doing a video call. Maybe you don't even call it a video call anymore, but it's pretty normal to have some type of communication with somebody else. It's not only that you're speaking, but you're also looking at their video while you do that. And we get value from that in different ways. So AT&T in the 1960s had identified that it is possible to do this. They actually had a demo of the picture phone at the 1964 World's Fair in New York City. And they had people making these calls. And, they would interview people who were attending the fair about, the likelihood that they wanted to, have a picture phone device, or that they wanted to do this type of new communication with video. And a lot of the feedback they received was positive. It was really positive. In fact, if I go and look at some of the results from back then, they had both the consumer and the business customers. So on the business customer side, about 30% said, they'd be interested in having this device, even if the cost was relatively high. On the consumer side, pretty similar, because people were thinking like, oh, I'm going to talk to family members or friends, and this is going to be more enjoyable than simply picking up the telephone and having a voice conversation. So they did these tests, these trials in 1964, and they were marching towards a commercial launch date. And one of the quotes that I found from back then really told this story to me. So this is 1968. This is from the president of Bell Labs. So if you're not familiar, Bell Labs is not what it used to be, I suppose. Bell Labs was a powerhouse of corporate innovation back when the corporate innovation labs were much, I suppose, like you could say, much more innovative, maybe, than they ended up being later on. But, this is the group that developed the transistor, fiber optics, mobile telephony, and, on the networking side, certainly a lot of the technology that powered, the later decades, and we're still using now. The president of Bell Labs in 1968 said, the trials of the picture phone have now progressed to a point where any skepticism as to its interest and utility is only a replay of the skeptical response which greeted Alexander Graham Bell when he tried to promote the telephone over 90 years ago. In other words, stop challenging, this new product. It's happening. If you challenge it, you are just like a skeptic from 90 years ago who said, oh, the telephone's a fad. Who wants to do that? That's, it's ridiculous. So what happened shortly afterwards? So they did this commercial release in 1970, and almost nobody bought the device. And they basically conceded, and they admitted defeat in 1971, and you never really hear about the thing. But the lead up to it was so extreme. It's like a $4 billion investment in so much of that new technology that was developed. You can imagine this is being done over the twisted copper pair, the wires that would go into the phone that would power the old legacy telephone. So it's quite something to be able to do audio and video, on these devices. But it was a complete flop. We can learn and look back on why this product failed. But maybe before that, I'll just pause for a moment. It's kind of instructive to say, like, here are some really smart people investing for years, and maybe also getting to the point where they're not able to make a good decision because they have invested so much and they don't want to call it a loss. But it's really instructive.
There's a lot there. I'm just thinking from like a decision quality perspective is sometimes, and in my work with clients, is that they fall in love with the thing and they're so invested in the process of getting to where they develop something, or they're ready to get some funding, or there's some fatigue, but there's also sunk cost kind of thing happening whereby they just fall in love with the thing. And then they may not ask themselves all the questions that you have in your book around all these timing drivers around, well, we're assuming lots of stuff actually that may not hold or may change or we just haven't thought about. And there's also on the reverse side is the naysayers that I kind of taking that away from your work, is that they're people who kind of assume there's a status quo bias thing happening whereby people might think, oh, well, no one will ever want you. I think you talked about this in the mobile phone thing. Who wants to walk around with a mobile phone and start, yapping away on public transport? That's ridiculous. I'd never want to do that. And yet behaviors change. In fact, behaviors is one of your drivers. So there's a lot there that I think decision makers kind of get to this sort of point and they don't dive into this timing question as a part of decision making is a missing, or maybe it's an under, I don't know what your experience has been. Maybe it's an under considered aspect perhaps in the startup world, but there's a lot that you unpick in, like, you've got these 12 drivers and there's all these things to think about. You open up this world of timing and it really changes the perspective on the product and the thing. And the whole, the point about the thing with the product is it's not just about the product. Like I'm sure that they created Bell Labs created a wonderful, wonderful product, or the streaming thing, or, it's not just having a great product, is it?
No, definitely not. Yeah, I think we can get some hints along the way to guard against making, what ended up being a pretty bad decision, in the case of the picture phone. I'll mention actually a few things that happened that might have given AT&T some pause back then.
Okay.
When it comes to, should we progress along? We have this demo. Should we keep going? So they did that 1964 World's Fair demo where they had the different picture phone booths. And so, they had that up for a while. And the interesting thing for me was when I found some of the statistics on usage back then. If I remember right, those picture phone booths were used only, I think, 71 times. So here is a massive event, many thousands of people attending. Here's a very novel product, but nobody's really using it. And so that might give us a bit of a clue, like, why is it not being used very often? And it's right there. And it's like, wow, this is so exciting. And then the other thing, this is more of an internal looking question, is so AT&T, part of the reason for developing the picture phone or wanting to go out strong with it was that they believed that once they had it out there and everybody saw how amazing this was, it would just release this torrent of demand for the devices, in turn that would mean that, wow, they have to upgrade their network. They have got to, like, because they're kind of jury rigging things and, like, putting extra line into the home to, handle the video. And, like, they're kind of making things work home by home or business office by office. But eventually they're going to have to upgrade their network. So some of the belief back then was all of the revenue from these picture phone devices will enable us to build this ultra modern network with much higher bandwidth. Like some people in retrospect say, like, oh, maybe that would have unleashed something like the internet a couple decades earlier than we actually saw it. But yeah, on both sides, you can kind of see, like, okay, there's some clues that the demand isn't quite there, and then also, like, there's something that's also pushing us to want to go forward because, like, oh, we would benefit from this high bandwidth network. Here's an excuse to develop it.
It's so easy to kind of look at past decisions and attack all the things that they got
Right.
wrong. I do sort of see when you describe that, I just see something quite circular. The product is kind of, there's only 71 people using them, and then once we build it, then this will happen. It is sort of a circular thing that seems to happen, or that happened in this particular case. Timing, like this whole thing about being too early is like, could you talk a little bit about that? Like, you hear that a lot, right? So-and-so was ahead of its time. This product was ahead of its time. Who wants to be ahead of their time, really? You want to be, you want to be at the right time. So ahead of its time isn't a badge of honor, but we kind of use it as a badge of honor that they're so this person or this product is so visionary that, it was just ahead of its time. It sort of predicted what was going to happen. If they were just a little bit, they just a little bit later, they'd be able to hang on, or I don't know, whatever the thing is, but weren't they so smart? But actually, you don't want to be ahead of your time, right? So talk to us a little bit about the problem with that and why that happens.
Sure. It's so true. It is a way of kind of feeling better about a bad outcome. Like, oh, I was ahead of my time. Somebody else did something pretty similar 10 years later, but I can still feel good about myself. I was first, right? Yeah. But it's really, pretty poor consolation, I suppose. Like you would certainly much rather have been the one that succeeded, even if you were later. Some of this, I think, belief in wanting to be really early, or believing that you've got to be first to market, or being early is better. Some of that comes from what we call first mover advantage, or that term first mover advantage. So I remember back during the .com era in the 90s, the term first mover advantage was used again and again as an argument as to why a specific .com era startup should be funded. Hey, this is the first company that's going to do this online. Basically, you're taking like all of these offline products and moving them online, and the first to do that is going to have this massive success. So that was kind of a de facto assumption. Hey, we have to seek out these opportunities to be first. There is an advantage to that, first mover advantage. And so the funny thing is, so I'd heard this term, and I'd also heard over the years after the .com era bubble burst, I had heard it really isn't the case. It's often the later movers that truly succeed. And I went back and, I realized, I had never read the research that produced that term, first mover advantage. It's actually a 1988 paper that was written that described first mover advantage. While that term was used in the 90s as, the way to fund a lot of those early startups, we've got to be first. That was not what the authors of that paper had actually said. Like, they didn't say, you must be the first to market because it is advantageous to be so. Instead, to kind of sum up, they said, if you are first to market and you can also control access to resources, in other words, you can keep out those later entrants, okay, maybe then there is an advantage. Or if you are first to market and you can also lock in your customers, in other words, prevent them from leaving for the later, maybe better alternative, you also might have an advantage. But in most cases, those first movers are not the long-term winners. And so that was kind of instructive. Like, here's a piece of research that's really being misapplied to fund all these these .com era startups that come along later. And even now, I think we see some kind of just intuitive elements of that, oh, I just feel like being first to market is the way to win, and nobody else realizes I've got to run ahead and do this or fund this or be involved somehow. So once you start thinking a little differently about when you enter a market, then you start to say, actually, what kind of organization are we? And this is one of the elements in my overall process. What kind of organization are we? Are we the type of organization that is actually really good at moving fast, building things that are on kind of like the cutting edge, moving fast and being able to deploy them? Or are we an organization that's, maybe not quite so fast moving, but we're great at marketing? And once we notice something and we see some alternatives, or we see some behavior changes, or some, some technological or regulatory or other types of demand that are, out there, we can be thoughtful in our approach and actually win because we are better at reaching our customers and actually better at understanding them and building something that might be just slightly different, but it's really a better fit. And we enter later on. In the book, I kind of give some considerations that you might walk through as you decide, okay, do I actually want to enter on the early side? Do I actually want to enter maybe in the middle when that market window is wide open? Or do I want to enter maybe on the late end, but I'm going to be a niche player, which is actually okay, but I'm going to go deep into one specific customer segment, and I'm going to satisfy that segment in a way that they are not being taken care of by the more mainstream products. So there's many ways to win this game, but the riskiest of those is probably be the first entrant. You really don't know what's happening with this market just yet. So I kind of walk through a number of examples when we had the first entrant, and then they fail. And then often, in many cases, a pretty, not that many years later, we see the later entrants come along and they have a massive success.
Right. And you even talk about, it doesn't have to even be the later entrant. Sometimes it's just, wasn't Spotify founded, you mentioned a month after the competitor or something?
Right. There, so that Spotify example, it was funny for me because I used to use this company called Grooveshark, which I forget, a friend of mine told me about them. Unlike Spotify, they did not have any audio ads. So it was amazing. The music just keeps playing and it's free. Right. I was able to use them internationally. That's another benefit. In the early days, Spotify just had certain regions or certain countries where they were available. And I thought, wow, this is incredible. I can't believe that they can actually make this business work, but I'll certainly enjoy it. And then I remember one day going to Grooveshark, and I actually put the letter in the book. I see this announcement, hey, we have to shut down. We were actually playing all this music without permission, from the artists or the recording labels. So that's why we were able to do it, because we didn't have to pay royalties, or we didn't have to go through all of that negotiation. Whereas Spotify did all that in the beginning. Yeah, they were maybe slower to market, but in something like music streaming, you might get away with that behavior short term, but eventually you're going to have to account for not paying royalties or streaming without permission. But it was funny to me, here are two examples of companies that, both were, even Grooveshark at its height, say, was relatively significant, and they were both founded within a month of each other. There's something to say, people in different places were recognizing, oh, here's this opportunity. There's enough internet bandwidth. Enough people have, say, Wi-Fi on their laptops. Back then, this is, I believe 2006 or 2008 when they started. We can get access to these, digital files that can then be streamed, and we can measure demand of certain songs, and then kind of optimize for that. Yeah, it was kind of instructive that. Unlike the earlier, say, Napster, 1990s, era startup.
I remember Napster.
Napster. Napster was really interesting. Just getting access to enough bandwidth to not stream but download those files.
Yeah, I remember it taking 45 minutes to download a song or something that may or may not have had the right royalties attached to them or what have you. But but that also raises an interesting point in question because we have this status quo bias. We have this sort of belief that the way the world is now is the way that it's always going to be. And number one, it's very hard for us to think about how things might change, but there are ways in which we can think about that. And then you make a really good point in the book that there are some things that are not going to change. We need to think about those too, right? So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of these timing drivers. Maybe you've got 12 of them in the book, but you talk about how regulations might change or behavior. Sometimes that's interesting to look at with demographics and younger generations who are at the moment, eschewing home ownership, for example, or putting off marriage and things like this. All of these things that are some of them are trends, but some of them are maybe not going to change. Some of them may change, but it's very hard for us to think about the future in those terms. And maybe we get that wrong. Sometimes we think I'm still, there's no flying cars. We're in year 2024. There are no flying cars now. Mm-hmm. I used to think, maybe from Saturday morning cartoons, I used to think that would be a thing that would happen, but it's very difficult to kind of break that down. But you kind of unpick that, and so maybe we could just dive into some of these timing drivers and maybe how to think about those.
So I list 12 of these in the book, and it's not that there's a magic number of 12 or there's only 12 necessarily. These are 12 that I saw come up again and again. I present them in a high level, more general way. So anyone who's actually going through this process is going to go into the details on those. For example, the first one I list is the technological driver. Yeah. Very high level. Everyone probably is familiar with something like Moore's Law. But really, if you're doing this, you're not only saying like, oh, okay, Moore's Law, therefore we would expect cost to decline on this kind of a schedule. You're probably looking at specific technologies that you're tracking. You're probably going out and you're talking to maybe experts in that field. You're getting much more granular about how you expect things to change. And so in that regard, say on the technological driver, and I'll just spend a little time on this one because it is a more common one. You're basically saying like, is this as good as it's going to get? And like a lot of the times that we might struggle and say like, hey, why are we not seeing this, just yet? Like your flying car example, or, oh, that's going to be impossible. There's no way that we will ever be able to do, X, Y, Z. That thought process of, hey, is this as good as it's going to get? Like what would need to change for us to see something radically different, or something that was prohibitively expensive or impossible now become cheap or possible? I mean, one of the probably overused examples of that is what we see with space travel. So like a company like SpaceX versus decades ago, the legacy like NASA or really like government agency type of level organization. It's impossible for a private company to do anything related to space. It's just like too complicated, too expensive. You need a government to do that type of work. Yeah. And then, you have a founder, Elon Musk, example, like saying like, actually, what if I think about all the changes in the cost components and how rocket technology is developing? All of a sudden, we can actually have a private company that does a more efficient job than these old legacy government agencies. That's, say, a technological driver that we might look into. There's a number of others. I won't go through the entire list of 12, okay, now, but you mentioned social or behavioral, drivers. So this again is one where we can kind of learn a couple things from, both on the change and on the non-change side, because certainly, there are new habits, new practices, new, even sometimes fads that we might be following and deciding, okay, as a business, do we want to participate in this in some way? And on the other hand, there are just enduring human needs. Maybe we just go back to something like Maslow's pyramid, the hierarchy of needs that like everybody has. We're not going to stop, say, eating or, I don't imagine, or sleeping, I don't imagine anytime soon. And so we might say, okay, we have these enduring needs. We also have some changing behaviors or preferences that just emerge because, if you look back in history, the way people used to live, it is different in some ways, not every way, but it is different in some ways than we live today. So how do we get some clues as to where we might play? So this can be a very tricky one because here we're talking about complex systems, the way people interact. But one example of where we might get a clue that, okay, there's an opportunity that's emerging is we see some niche group with some new behavior, and we learn about that, and we try to understand, okay, is this something that's likely to just stay in this niche, or is this the kind of thing that could spread to the mainstream population? And then we might, decide, okay, do we want to actually participate in that, or do we think it's beneficial for us, to participate in that, as well? Some of those, those social or behavioral ones are, maybe a little tricky. As an example, an old example, but one that I think we can kind of appreciate for how things eventually played out. I remember decades ago when online dating was still relatively new, and then hearing from a friend, they met their girlfriend or boyfriend, online, and it was a little bit like, what? That's a little weird, right? That's like, is there a problem? Right. Yeah. Right. Exactly. Right. And now it is like it's so normal. In fact, I even remember seeing a chart of how people met their significant other or spouse over the decades. I don't know, I'm roughly going to have this right, but 50 years ago, it was people would meet their significant other because a family member would introduce them, or they would meet them at a religious organization, and then after that, it was they would meet them at work. A bit after that, it was maybe at school. But the more recent one is completely online. You have abstracted away any of those real those personal relationships, family or a colleague or a religious organization, and it's abstracted away to an algorithm. How would your friends or family members or colleagues know best? The algorithm has this much wider pool of people to draw from, and this is how we make the match. Something very, very different about the way matches are made today, for better or worse, I suppose.
Yeah, and finding.
I'll mention one more.
Yeah, sure. I was just you also mentioned cannabis as another example. And sometimes I think that popular culture is an interesting one to watch. What's popular and why, and how might that influence customer behavior in some way. But the cannabis thing is really interesting. And I guess increasingly the whole psychedelics space is another, there's certain shifts that may happen in popular culture that I guess if you've got your eyes on a niche group or certain demographic groups or whatever, you think, that makes sense. But if you're older, you think, what do you mean? Psychedelics, cannabis? There were all these movies about the dangers of marijuana in the 70s and 80s and say no to drugs and all this stuff. And how do we get here? So, but if you've got your eyes on certain areas, you can picture that, you can figure that out.
Yeah. The cannabis one is also interesting because the latent, say, gray market demand was there for decades and decades. And it was always just, at least in the US, many parts of the world, I suppose, suppressed in some way, either officially or in some markets, it was, a bit of a gray area. You're not really sure, but you're probably not going to build a real business on that type of a product. So this is an example where as I was learning about timing, years back, I actually decided to invest, in this market. And it was also just a way for me to say, am I right in the way I'm thinking? So I remember in the US, I believe this was 2018, when there were some additional steps taken towards legalization of cannabis. And I thought, okay, I actually want to play a bit in this market. I don't use the product, but I just think there is something's going to be opened up. Demand's going to be opened up. It was latent, and it's either going to be it's going to be opened up, or all the gray market, black market demand is going to move to more official sources, and there's some benefit there. Yeah. So I decided to, okay, I'm going to invest in two different companies because, again, I don't know who's going to win, but I'm going to take a bit of a portfolio approach. And I thought, okay, I at least am trying to work this as a process. One of them, which was actually the smart choice, because people were comparing it to, it's this is the Apple Store, of cannabis, eventually lost, I want to say 9.5% of value, really because of a scandal with the founders. But this other one, which is some no-name comparable, did incredibly well. And it was kind of okay, all this demand is being unleashed all of a sudden. And maybe long term, it goes right back to the incumbent, say, tobacco companies, and they start basically controlling that cannabis market. There are situations where you can actually experiment and say, like, okay, I want to test how good this decision is. I want to see there's going to be some regulatory change. I know it's coming. I want to therefore enter that market in some way. And I'm going to be able to test, was I right or wrong in that decision? Yeah, like the cannabis one is interesting, for a number of reasons, but especially on like the, the regulatory side.
Yeah. You were going to mention another one of the timing drivers.
Yeah, maybe I'll just mention crisis as one.
Yeah.
This is one. So when you think like, how can crisis be a driver? Because we most likely anyway, we're not creating a crisis ourselves intentionally anyway. We can't really say, okay, a crisis is definitively going to come in 1 or 2 years. But we certainly see crises all the time. In fact, there's a crisis happening like around the world, like every single day. Some of them are localized, right? But some are global. So like, of course, the most common example, at least of the last few years, is, the pandemic. So it's instructive in terms of timing because all of a sudden, much of the world is thrown into this very different environment. You are forced into, for example, a remote work environment, like suddenly, or you're forced into some type of like a social distancing, regimen, something like that all of a sudden happens with really very little warning. But what happens, during that time? Like there are companies who, well, if they can move fast and produce something that's beneficial in that new environment, you can really win. So like I had a friend who back then, I didn't hear from him for a while. And then like afterwards, he told me like, oh yeah, he had started a COVID testing business and, did really well. It's the kind of thing that if you can enter quickly, there's huge demand for it and it's not going to last forever. So you have to say like, okay, I'm going to do well enough for those couple of years and that's the end and that's okay. And so like we saw like repeated examples of this and even the kind of say US or China company, differences in approach. Is this the kind of thing that's going to last only a few months, which, in the beginning, maybe a lot of people kind of believed, oh, this is going to blow over by summer. Therefore, I shouldn't go into it at all. I'll just ride it out and, it'll be I won't be able to recover the investment that I, put into it. And that was the perspective of many companies in the US, I'll say, whereas a lot of the Chinese companies, and this is, speaking very broadly, said like, oh, we'll do the mask, production. We could spin up that product line pretty quickly.
Yeah.
We'll do the, the PP&E or the different kind of like basic products that were just suddenly in high demand. And who knows, maybe the demand goes away in 3 months. But yeah, I guess like the differences in how long will it take us to spin up that new product line could be hugely advantageous. If it only lasts a few months, maybe we have to decide, do we enter or not? But when it ended up lasting much longer than a few months, like, oh, some of those earlier decisions came to haunt us. And like, oh, now we're dependent on, sourcing internationally, for a lot of these products. So yeah, like the crisis one is interesting because if you can move quickly, and you're in this, what might be a really negative environment, like, actually, you could come out with this product that satisfies demand and makes people's lives better. If instead you say, this isn't appropriate for us, or we are not coincidentally in a good place to satisfy that demand, you might say like, okay, we have to wait this one out, but maybe there's a future one where we will be, in a good spot.
The crisis one is interesting. I've recently co-written a book called Decision Making in the Poly-Crisis Era. And one of the things I'm convinced is that we'll have more crises over the next 5 to 10 years, but we don't know exactly what sources, how they're going to play out, where, all of that stuff. But there's just so much volatility and uncertainty that there will be something else that comes up in the next few years. Can't really predict how it's going to unfold.
The interconnectedness of the world of today versus of decades or centuries past, really goes to that. Just going back to that COVID example, like I remember, so I used to work a lot in China. And I remember when the pandemic was like, awareness was just starting of it, I looked at the air travel between China. I think I just looked at China, China to the US, like air travel of 2020 or 2019 maybe versus I forget what, a decade earlier or 2 decades earlier.
Yeah.
And it was, I want to say, like it had grown by like 20x or more, in that, say 10 years or so. If you do have, an emergence of, some, pathogen, whatever the reason that it emerges, in terms of how fast it's going to spread or how likely it is to spread.
Yeah.
If you're going from a world where, okay, people are moving around, but not super fast or not like in incredible numbers versus, yeah, we have incredible numbers of people, going from country to country and air travel is fast. And yeah, you can appreciate how much more quickly something can spread around the world, today than, a century ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Firstly, and this is hindsight bias, but had the world shut down in December of 2019 completely for, let's say, 4 weeks, we could have arguably gotten rid of it. So, and it wouldn't have been there would be no opportunity for the testing and the masks and all the rest of it, arguably. But at any rate, I want to dive into how you kind of pull all these things together. Like, how do you you talk about having a why now session and how to explore this question properly of, is this the right time? Because there's all this, you've got these drivers, you've got some really useful stuff. But if we're thinking like someone who's listening to this, maybe they work in a corporate environment, or maybe they're their own, they work in a private, their own startup or their own company. And we're thinking about a decision, a product launch or something. How do you pull this together? How do you properly explore this question of, and this is where I think you make a really great contribution with this book, is that this is not a question that is really properly explored in decision making in sort of a product sense, or actually maybe it's not just products, but it could be anything like a big merger or an organizational change or something. Like, how do we properly explore this question of why now? So just wondering if you could paint a picture. This idea of a why now session sounds great, but what does that look like?
Sure. This is really my attempt to, I know that you're interested in this topic, of course, but really my attempt to help people in the way they make a decision related to new product introduction or investment in a new product or a business, and how to keep them a little more honest as they go through that, because we certainly like to fool ourselves. I was actually thinking about this morning. I didn't put this in the book, but one of the ways I suppose I became interested how people fool ourselves, we fool ourselves or we project this public face that is not accurate, is one of the first jobs I had. I was actually a speechwriter, and I would occasionally, maybe monthly, I would also do some type of a kind of a roundup of, what's going on around the company, and like share this with different offices, this newsletter to, write up, okay, this office is, this department's working on such and such. And I remember there was this new product being launched. I won't mention what it was, but they had actually come out, and I was there in this meeting where they were announcing some of the projections that they were going to see by, such and such a time, it's going to be this scale or this many users, that type of thing. And I was in that meeting. And so I decided, I'm going to write up what's going on to this new launch. And then I just started writing it up, and I just mentioned it to someone who was working on the team. And then, she said, could I take a look at that? And I said, oh, sure. Okay. Hey, why don't we just lower those numbers about 10% or so? Like, okay, it's not what you earlier said, but all right, sure. 10% off, getting ready to send it out. Another person from the team, it might've been her manager, comes over. Can I take a look at what I see? Why don't we just take like 20, 30% off of that? Okay, do that again. And then a third visit. And again, I think this is like, the boss's boss. It comes over. Let's cut that in half. Let's just cut it in half, And so like all of a sudden I was just getting this, here's all this mixed feedback. Like, well, you kind of came out with this announcement. Sure, maybe it was in a closed door session, but like you said, this is going to happen. I innocently think I can share this. And then all of a sudden you realize the rest of the business is going to hear about our projections. We are no longer as confident in them. We want to step back. And so I'm writing up a number that is a third of the size of what you had initially said. And so what I'm trying to do in this Why Now session is trying to keep people honest by bringing them through a process, but also having them with the expectation that okay, they are going to have what I call a challenge session at the end of their Why Now session. So they expect, I'm going to go through this and I'm going to show this to some people who are there because they are going to push back. Like I'm actually doing that because I am going to hear that pushback, right? But the basic steps that I outline are, as we have, and this could be, you could do this in multiple formats. You might be a product team. You might be on the investment side. There's a number of formats you could do this. Basically, you have this new thing that you are thinking of launching or investing in. You're going through those timing drivers. I outline 12 of them, but you're probably going into more detail than I, just show in the book, because you have that industry knowledge, or you are the experts in, those timing drivers. You're diagramming them. And so this is where I'm interested in, how do we think things are going to change over time? Like we earlier said, if it's a technological driver, here are the price points for, a battery, of this type. How is that going to change, in the future? How do we think we're going to be more efficient? Right? And however that might fit to the, any of the 12 that you choose. We build what I call timing maps. So here we stack up those different timing drivers. And we also add to that examples of other companies or other products that were kind of similar to what we're doing, but they were tried earlier on. So now we're going to learn from some previous, maybe failed, maybe not, examples. And we're going to actually try to think, okay, so this was tried before. Why didn't it work out earlier on? Is that relevant anymore? Maybe, maybe things have changed. And so it's not really something that should hold us back. We're also going to look around and say, who else is playing in this market today? Are there other competitors that are doing something like this, which actually could be a good sign? Other people are noticing there's an opportunity, and maybe that actually is telling us could be on the right track. And then, like one of the last activities is I have people draw what I call the too early lines. So for any of these timing drivers, we say, okay, at what point do we believe, and this is, your perspective might be a little different from mine, but at what point do we believe it would be, or it was, too early for us to successfully do something in this market based on a business model impact? Another piece of this is, how do these timing drivers improve our business model or create a new potential business model? If the business model doesn't improve, or if a new one is not created, there's no timing advantage. You might have a new capability. You could actually do the thing or build the thing, but it's not financially sustainable in terms of a business model. High level, that's that Why Now session. And then you're left with, all this research. I have people summarize it in just a single slide. And I give examples of doing this. Why? Because this is an easy way to talk through where you get. But if you don't do all that earlier research, looking at the timing drivers, building the timing maps, et cetera, if you don't do all of that, you're making it up. You're not going to be able to defend your position, right? And then the follow-up to that is, so you send this to your challenge team, and you'll have to appropriately choose who's on that challenge team. But you send it to them, and then you have a challenge session where they try to pick apart your reasoning, and you're left with either another go around, or maybe like, we don't have anything strong to say against your decision. And I give some examples of questions that the challenge team might be asking as they go through that process. But like those two pieces, like the Why Now session and the format for doing that, and then the challenge session, I think help to keep people a little honest. You go in just expecting people are going to push back, and this is how we should be thinking about our overall decision-making process. But that's a high-level kind of introduction.
Yeah, I love that for a number of reasons. One is you're probably giving people license to think in divergent ways, right, about how things could change, but also you're embedding challenge into the process. So you're actually also embedding dissent, which are two things that don't seem to happen nearly as often as they should. And in fact, that example you gave of take 5% off, take 10% off, take another 25% off of your projections, that's actually how a lot of this works in a lot of places. These organizations do this, and a lot of that is driven by optics, and there are biases, there are expectations, there are There are these short-term incentives. There's all this stuff that impedes that thinking in a more robust way about not just timing, but about anything. But I just really love that dedicated exploration of timing. It's something more organizations should do, just embed that. And so that's great. I did want to touch on one thing as well that you mentioned in the which I also quite liked, and maybe just touch on it, but the problem solving versus problem finding. You have a section in the book that I forget where the quote is, but it's something about that we're set up for problem solving, but we need to get better at problem finding. Also, wondering if you just touch on what that's all about.
Yes, and I believe you're talking about a section called the problem solving problems. And so this was actually something that I hadn't really thought seriously about until I saw this talk done by Alan Kay. And he is, in the past, he was working at Xerox PARC, another one of these big corporate innovation labs, famously the place that Steve Jobs had gone and, gotten some ideas about, using a computer mouse, in the Mac. It was also the place that, and I believe this was 1968, where the mother of all demos, was held. This is Douglas Engelbart, demonstrated in this, big session at Xerox PARC, networking capabilities and the computer mouse and like all of these technologies that now we take for granted.
Yeah.
But which Xerox really did not commercialize, or not successfully. And so I heard this talk from someone who used to work at Xerox PARC. And he actually mentioned a number of things that I then followed up with. But one of his points was, we are trained to look for problems and then try to solve those problems. And instead, we should be looking for opportunities. Or I think he phrased it more around we should be finding the problems rather than just responding to an existing problem. Right. And so if you think instead about, how do I find a new opportunity? And it's not like someone is coming to me and telling me I'm struggling with, this or that.
Yeah.
Instead, it's, and this is even maybe on the social behavioral side, to give an example, rideshare, like Uber, Lyft, these companies that became very popular, very big, pretty quickly, but they launched, around 2009, 2010. It wasn't like back then people were saying oh, I wish there was some way for me to get around town. I would have, been on time to that meeting, but I'm just struggling getting around my city. It's not like people were saying that. It's I have a taxi that I could take. I could rent a car. I could take the train. I could walk. I have so many opportunities to get around town, in different ways. That's just the way it is. We have all these opportunities. And it was, so that we have that lack of a problem. And then it's the founders of these rideshare companies saying, let's see, we have critical mass of people with a smartphone. The smartphones have a GPS chip in them. Those third generation smartphones, so not the initial ones, they were a little too slow to do turn-by-turn directions, but now they're getting fast enough where I could do real-time navigation. People are now familiar and comfortable with online payments, having your credit card, online. People are also comfortable with getting into a taxi that a stranger is driving. As long as I have a rating system, I can say okay, we've, the algorithm has vetted this person, I shouldn't worry about that. Unlike, say, a licensed taxi driver that maybe goes through some type of a check. So all these things start falling into place, but there's an absence of a problem. No one's saying I wish I could get around, the city, but there's no way to do it. No, I have all these options. So, in that environment, you say okay, this new opportunity emerges. I'm going to build something that satisfies this new thing that we could, build, like rideshare in that case, right? And I'm going to produce a solution that is actually better than taking a taxi or the bus or walking or not going, right? I'm going to produce something that's, better, but which could not have been built shortly earlier. And as a result, I'm going to, change the way people say navigate or get around a city. I'm going to, be able to build a big business around this, but I had to get there not from a problem finding,
Yeah.
mindset instead of a, like an opportunity, identification, mindset. And yeah, so like that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
As you were
go ahead.
talking, I was actually like thinking about your work on unintended consequences, because this is what happens with unintended consequences. I can kind of see the connection between your work on timing and the whole unintended consequences, because something is introduced and then you have these secondary and tertiary effects, and we didn't know that they existed before, but now all of a sudden there's a new opportunity. It's a different way of thinking about something. It's less linear and much more, yeah, it's much more divergent. So it's I can see from your research interest how these two things are connected here.
Yeah. Yeah, it's certainly fun, to think about these things. I guess the connection between the two sides is just trying to appreciate a system and, being able to say like, here is, here is this thing that's gaining popularity. Let's just play with that thought. What happens if all of a sudden it's mainstream? Or what happens if all of a sudden, like, one element of this business model improves and now we have a sustainable business model, and then, as a result, that attracts, investment, or that attracts like really smart founders who want to work in this area. So yeah, I think there's something to, there's something beneficial from just like playing with those ideas and then identifying new opportunities, new opportunities for, say, a product to exist. And it helps us kind of in that overall thought process.
Yeah, I agree. It's really useful stuff. We've covered a lot of ground. I'm just wondering if there's anything that you wanted to mention that you don't think we had enough time to adequately cover.
The only thing I'll just mention is one of the other components of the book is the section that I call timing patterns. And this is where I kind of offer these as something to spark new ideas. But in my research, I would, when I was going and looking at a lot of historical examples, I guess, primarily as to like what new businesses or, products kind of were spun up, what times and, what were some of the drivers there, I would find that there would be some patterns that would occur again and again. In other words, it's a combination of 2 or 3, of these timing drivers, and then it produces some kind of outcome. And so I think there's something to learn from that. I'm not trying to predict the future here, but I'm basically trying to say, here are some clues. If we see these 2 or 3 drivers changing in some way, they combine in this pattern. Here's what we've seen happen in the past with these new opportunities that emerge and new products that come from that. If we see something like that happening today, maybe that clues us into the modern version of those earlier products or those earlier outcomes.
Right.
And so that might spark some new thoughts for anyone reading this book. And then maybe like just the other thing I would want to say is I'm not trying to claim that this is a deterministic world. Yeah. If these timing drivers are changing in such a way, like, therefore we must see this outcome. There's certainly founder agency. People, in fact, we depend upon founders, or like, innovators working on certain things where maybe everybody else is telling them this is a ridiculous idea, or maybe like all of their research is telling them like, yeah, there's no supporting business model for this. Like, you're way too early, just don't do it. But a lot of that activity or energy that founders bring, they can pull that future forward faster, or they can create this unimagined new future that maybe never would have existed had they not been, on Earth. Yeah. So I'm not trying to say, let's just predict the future in this deterministic world. Rather, I'm trying to say, here are these clues. I think this is a good process because I've taken by this point multiple companies and portfolios of companies through this why now session, these kind of decision-making tools. I think there's something beneficial, and this is how we can make a better decision or decide. We have a number of directions we could go in. We need to choose one or a handful. Timing is a filter that we could put on that decision-making process. Here's how we get to that decision that we make in the end. So yeah, so that's what I hope people will take away from the book or a discussion about timing.
Yeah, it's great. I also think, as you were talking about that founders are important to the ecosystem, the economic ecosystem, the development ecosystem, because we need that, in aggregate. Like otherwise you can't predetermine, no matter how many tools we use, we can't predetermine new approaches, discoveries, etc. And there's a serendipity that we need to almost program in, or just make sure that we have embedded. Actually, we didn't, maybe this is a good thing. We didn't talk about AI at all. And I'm just wondering if you have any sort of general thoughts, maybe just under, sort of two things. One is the use of Gen AI to start thinking about the timing question. Is that useful? But perhaps more broadly, is there any general thoughts you might have about right now? It just seems like the whole zeitgeist is all about Gen AI and the whole question. Sure. If you have any thoughts about how people are looking at timing about Gen, because I do see that sort of that sense of, oh, we have to do that. We have to do this on Gen AI. Like we have to be here. We have to do this. And maybe that's not true. Maybe there's another way of looking at that. So just wondering if you have any overall thoughts on that you wanted to share.
Sure. So on Gen AI, I mean, there's so many of these related tools, even if you're not doing anything like deep in the technology. So I figure that probably just about any business person should be playing with something related to Gen AI, even if it's only educational or just like just to be aware of what's out there. I mean, a lot of the thought on this, of course, is, well, long term, do the returns on Gen AI really just go back to the incumbents, like the companies that are producing like the infrastructure, like the actual models that other companies are using? And that could certainly be the case. So I would think about it if you're using Gen AI as a research tool, for example. And I've done this, I think, both successfully and unsuccessfully. Really just be sure that you're not going through the motions. If you're using Gen AI as your research assistant, but they are also not a very well-trained, kind of a hapless assistant, and like they're just giving back. When I was writing the book, I did try using ChatGPT and some of the others. Sure. As a way of like either testing some of the ideas, or like, hey, find me examples of companies that kind of have operated in this way or that way. At least my outcomes there, like I wasn't enough satisfied that I wanted to go with anything that was produced by the Gen AI output. Might be that I just wasn't training it well enough. Might be realistically that I felt I knew the topic well enough that it was just faster for me to do all of that analysis, or I had read enough by that point that it was faster for me to just do it myself, which I think always happens. I've like demoed in the past like some of these new technologies, but yeah, in some cases like okay, it might hallucinate, or like the results not exactly what I wanted. I could just do this faster myself, so maybe it's better for me to do that. But I think there are opportunities there, and maybe it's just, hey, let's get that first cut. Or let's just prompt it in some way because we just want to be surprised. Like I'm looking for that unusual response that maybe we didn't think about, and it's going to give us one more opportunity to consider. I would probably explore it, and much more beneficial if you have maybe it's an in-house body of training, some data that you can then use it respond against. But yeah, in terms of the business models, so many startups that are doing something related to Gen AI, and a lot of investor interest in this. Really a question of like, what are the ones that have the staying power, or that have the business models that can actually enable them to last long term? So yeah, I mean, like one of the things following, I guess, this book is, and I love doing this, but like a lot of people reach out to me on this. So I end up doing either the Why Now session internally for some other group, or like taking them through that process and maybe they run it internally. Yeah, so far I've done all the delivery on that like myself, rather than saying, okay, here's the product that's standalone, and you just put it into Why Now GPT, and you run it yourself. But I don't know. I'm happy to talk to anybody about that, because I enjoy this topic so much, and I end up having these conversations quite a lot.
Okay, Paul, this was fabulous. Before we go, for people that have enjoyed this and want to maybe get in touch or get a copy of Why Now and have a conversation with you or anything like that, get your advice and support, what are the best ways to do that?
In terms of finding me, probably the best way to find me is LinkedIn. Just look for Paul Orlando. I'll pop up. Or you could look for startupsunplugged.com. which is where I initially wrote about this topic a couple of years ago. And it was some of that initial feedback that convinced me to keep going down this road. But otherwise, if you like the book, Why Now? How Good Timing Makes Great Products, you can find that on Amazon. But yeah, happy to talk to anybody who is interested in timing.
Paul, this is great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time to chat.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, great to be here.